Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode 72 of Be With Me in the book of Romans. We're going to find out about two new people today. And this is from Romans chapter 16, verse 3. Greet Prisca, that's a female, and Aquilla, that's a male, they're husband and wives. And he describes them as my fellow workers in Christ Jesus who risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well. Greet also the church in their house. So Paul is writing to the book to Romans. He's writing back to Rome, and we find that these people, Prisca and Aquilla, have a church in their house at the time of this writing. Now, we know lots about Prisca and Aquilla. We actually have a 20-year history. This writing here is about halfway through that history. So we know about Prisca and Aquilla from 49 AD, and we know about that because we have a very hard timestamp on that, because that was when Claudius commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So he said in Rome, all the Jews have to get out. And so Prisca and Aquilla, they were Jews, husband and wife, and they go to Corinth. Of interest, that was the same time when Paul was on his second missionary journey. Now, here's the interesting thing about Paul's missionary journeys, is the second one lasted for 3 years. The third one lasted for 4 years. Now, why did they take so long? Well, in both of those missionary journeys, he kind of holed up in one place for a long period of time. It was a different place. The second missionary journey, he holes up in Corinth for 18 months. On the third missionary journey, he holes up in Ephesus for 2 years. Now, of interest, Prisca and Aquilla were in both places where Paul holes up during the time where he spends all that time there. And in fact, Acts 18 says that Paul finds these guys because they had the same trade as him, which was tent making. And then he says that Paul stayed with them. And presumably, Paul stayed with Prisca and Aquilla for 18 months in Corinth on the second missionary journey. So a fascinating history. Imagine living with Paul day in and day out for 18 months. So then when Paul leaves Corinth, and he heads back at the very, very end of the third missionary journey, he is such good friends with the guys and such good co-workers with these guys. He takes Prisca and Aquilla, he takes them on the way home, and he drops them off in Ephesus. Now, Paul doesn't stay there very long, and he goes back to Jerusalem and Antioch to finish the second missionary journey. A couple years later, he starts the third missionary journey. That's in 53 AD. And on that missionary journey, he goes to Ephesus and stays in Ephesus for 2 years. And guess who's there? Again, Prisca and Aquilla. So they're not from Ephesus, and they weren't from Corinth. They're originally from Rome. So for the first 10 years of the time that we know about these guys, they leave Rome, Prisca and Aquilla I'm speaking of, they leave Rome, they go to Corinth, they stay with Paul for 18 months, they go to Ephesus, they're there for a couple of years, Paul comes back to Ephesus, he stays with, maybe he stays with them, it doesn't particularly say, but he's at least either in the same city, and Paul is arguing in the house of Tyrannus day after day. So I imagine that they participated in that. So of all the people that had exposure to Paul, I think that Prisca and Aquilla had the most exposure of any person possibly on the entire planet. So it's very interesting that we have a long history with them. But here's the great thing, is at the time that this was written in the book of Romans, 57 AD, Paul has about 10 years of life left. In his last book, or one of the last books for sure, 2 Timothy, Paul is abandoned by many of his friends. But at the end of 2 Timothy, he says to Timothy, hey, by the way, greet Prisca and Aquilla. So they they stayed with Paul. They continued to minister. They make the hit parade at his very last book, and then they mentioned something that's not specifically mentioned, that is that Paul, owe my life to them. They risked their necks, so they risked their lives for my life. Now, this probably was during the riot of Ephesus. We don't know that for sure, but there was a riot in the city. It was all about Artemis, the sort of the noted city god of theirs, and the city was full of confusion. The people were enraged. They were rushing around. They rush into the stadium, and Paul wished to go in among the group, and it says that the disciples, this is Acts 19:30, the disciples would not let them. Now, this is me talking here. I think that the disciples would not let them. It's not the Peter, James, and John. That's not the disciples we're talking about. We're talking about Paul's disciples. So Paul is in Ephesus. He's been there for 2 years. He has a group of people that follow him. Presumably this is Prisca and Aquilla, and I'm assuming that the disciples would not let them. They're speaking of Prisca and Aquilla sacrificed themselves and would not let Paul, and this was done at some personal peril. And he says in Romans that because they risked their lives, not only I give thanks, so I thank them, but all the churches of the Gentiles. So Paul's whole ministry, at least the second and third missionary journeys, somehow depended on these guys risking their lives for him. So here's what I wish for all of us. Paul is greeting Prisca and Aquilla, fellow workers in Christ, and I wish you workers like this. So they were faithful friends in the moment. Nobody woke up that day, possibly in Ephesus, saying, I'm going to risk my life for another person, but they were faithful in that moment, and they were also faithful for decades. We have a 20-year history of ministry, and 18 months where he lived with them, and 2 more years when maybe he lived with them in a different city. A very long history of Paul and Aquila and Prisca. So I wish you friends in the moment like this, and I wish you friends in the decades, just like Prisca and Aquila. Thanks for listening.